Magical plants often have a long association with particular qualities, such as protection or help in romantic affairs. In previous episodes, we've looked at the use of rowan as protection against witchcraft, while the use of roses in love magic persists in the link between roses and romance. But how about slightly less well-known magical plants? Well, in this episode, we're going to have a look at the folklore of Larkspur, Periwinkle and Wormwood. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I hope that your April is going well. We're just going to dive straight into this week's episode because there's not much need for any preamble. Although, as always, please do remember that as much as we're looking at the folklore of poisonous plants with magical properties, do remember that this episode is for entertainment purposes only. It is not designed nor intended to replace medical advice. So just don't consume any of these plants, basically, is the long story short. So in this week's episode, we are looking at Larkspur, Periwinkle and Wormwood because they do all have magical properties in some shape or form. And we're going to get started with the Larkspur or the Delphinium ajacis, and the Larkspur is actually an annual member of the buttercup family. Butterflies and bees love it, but the fact that it's toxic actually puts off most other creatures. And its name, Delphinium ajacis, comes from the ancient Greeks because they saw dolphin shapes in the way that the flower unfolded, hence Delphinium. Now, thankfully, there's not really that much about the plant that would say, hey, eat me. And it's really more harmful to cattle than humans when ingested, but somehow sheep are immune to its toxins, which is kind of strange. But there we go, we do sometimes get that with some plants. Some animals can eat it and other ones can't. But weirdly, despite its toxicity, some people think that soldiers actually use larkspur to help control body lice, which might explain its use in protection spells. And people in Transylvania at one point kept dried larkspur in their stables to protect animals from witchcraft. And larkspur could also apparently keep ghosts at bay, while the flowers could apparently frighten off scorpions. I'm not really sure how much of an issue scorpions are in most places now, but that is something that people did used to believe. And there are many links between larkspur and seeing, especially for scholars. And basically what was advised is scholars were supposed to keep larkspur on their desks and then glance at it often to soothe their tired eyes. And meanwhile, if you looked through bunches of larkspur at midsummer fires, it would then protect the eyes from ailments for the coming year. In the language of flowers, larkspur means levity, lightness and an open heart, but do please make sure you've got the right colour, because I think that's the blue one that refers to, because pink larkspurs meant fickleness and purple larkspurs meant haughtiness, and people once used its flowers to make blue dye. And according to Aaron Atzma, the plant we call the hyacinth is not actually the flower in the myth of Hyacinthos and Apollo. And this is what we had a look at last week with the bluebell, because most people assume that the hyacinth is the hyacinth that we know today that's part of this particular myth, but it's actually larkspur. Now, like I said last week, but in case you didn't hear that episode, the myth does have a couple of variations, but in both, Apollo, who's god of the sun, and Zephyros, who's god of the wind, love Hyacinthos, the Spartan prince. And in one variation, Hyacinthos chooses Zephyros, and then Apollo kills him in a fit of jealousy. In the other variation, Apollo is playing quoits with Hyacinthos, and then the jealous Zephyros controls the wind to catch Apollo's quoit, which strikes Hyacinthos in the head and kills him. In both variations of the myth, the Hyacinthos plant, or larkspur, then springs forth from his blood, and an AI or I appears on the petals, being the Greek word for alas, and as a result the larkspur is sacred to Apollo. And if you do look at the larkspur looking for where these letters appear, the A is actually upside down above an I, and you can sort of see them a little bit when you look at a photo of the larkspur. Now, the larkspur does actually also appear in another Greek myth, and this time it's that of the death of Ajax. And after his death, Achilles' armour goes to Odysseus. Ajax is none too happy about this because he wanted it, so he goes mad and throws himself on his own sword. The larkspur then grows from his blood, and the AI on the petals actually come from his Greek name, Aias, spelled Aias. So again, we've got another explanation for where this AI on the petals apparently come from. Also, there's a third mention of Larkspur in Greek myth, and apparently it was one of the flowers being gathered by Persephone before she was abducted by Hades. And she was also gathering rose, crocus, violet, iris and lily, and Larkspur was one of the other ones as well. So it's quite fascinating how much there is to do with Greek myth and Larkspur, and it's quite strange to find a plant that appears in 3 different myths, although 2 of them are to try and explain a particular botanical feature. They are really, really pretty plants, but obviously they are toxic, so it's best if you grow them, just leave them for the bees and the butterflies to do their thing and just admire them from afar. We're going to move on to Periwinkle or Vinca major, and this is also known as Sorcerer's Violet, Creeping Myrtle, Joy on the Ground and Devil's Eye, which is quite a weird collection of names, and is also known as cut finger from its use in treating wounds. Now, Sir Francis Bacon believed that you could bind its leaves around the leg to guard against cramp, and it also appeared as a remedy for boils, toothache and nosebleeds in Oxfordshire. I'm not quite sure how it was used for all of those 3 things, but there we go, that is what Margaret Baker says it was used for. Too much periwinkle can actually cause extremely low blood pressure. Now, periwinkle does actually have a range of medicinal uses because it contains a compound called vincamine, which is used in modern medicine as a cerebral stimulant, which is quite interesting because the plant also represents early recollections, memories and sweet remembrance. And periwinkle is believed to be used in magic to banish negative energy and restore mental clarity. And one little snippet of folklore actually suggests that gazing at periwinkle flowers would restore lost memories. So perhaps this is an example of magical plants actually having tangible effects. So it's quite cool that its use in modern medicine is actually reflected in its magical and folkloric use as well. Periwinkle grows naturally in graveyards, so it also gained many associations with death. And called Fiore di Morte, or Death's Flower in Italy, it appeared in funeral wreaths for children because it was believed appropriate to have, for their level of innocence, to have periwinkles. But strangely, in medieval England, condemned men wore garlands of periwinkles as they travelled to the gallows, which seems like a bit of an odd thing, unless they're using periwinkles to restore lost memories to make them think about what they've done on the way to the gallows. Plucking it from a grave in Wales actually brought bad luck and could even see you being haunted by the grave's owner. Now, these protective qualities, and I do mean protective in the sense of the funeral wreath for children and obviously also over a grave, did extend to the living, and people might hang bunches or wreaths of periwinkle on front doors to protect those inside. And travellers might also carry periwinkle for protection, which does therefore make it a bit of an odd choice to associate with condemned men. But anyway, we're going to go from the death associations to the love associations because it's hilarious how many plants have this link on both sides of that particular coin. And people would stuff the leaves of the periwinkle plant into the marital bed to promote fidelity and happiness. Growing it outside your home also helped to encourage harmony inside. And in the language of flowers, blue periwinkles represented early friendship. White periwinkles actually meant pleasures of memory, and the plant also appeared in recipes for love potions. And there's also an interesting piece of folklore about Matthias Night on February the 24th. And in this, girls were directed to make 2 wreaths, one of straw and one of periwinkle. And then they were to head to a running stream at midnight and lay the wreaths in the stream. And somehow, the folklore doesn't say how they would do this, they were also supposed to put a handful of ashes in the water, and they would apparently float. It's like, okay, whatever, but that is what the folklore says. And the girls were supposed to dance around blindfolded beside the water before stopping to choose one of the 3 items. The periwinkle meant that they would marry, the straw represented misfortune, and the ashes stood for death. So in this case, you've got the choice of the periwinkle then becoming a positive omen of marriage, unlike, as I say, the straw or the ashes. So it is quite interesting how many associations the periwinkle has ended up with, which are in some ways quite contradictory, but then in other ways kind of all sort of tie back into this idea of memory and harmony and things like that. Now, for our final plant of this episode, we are going to go to wormwood, or Artemisia absinthium. And wormwood contains the glucoside absinthium, which was used to flavour absinthe, and drinking too much of that could affect the sight, which would then make most things appear yellow, which could also explain why the plant was once known as madderwort at one point. Wormwood as a plant represents absence, adultery, bitterness, idolatry, and the torment of love. Yet in a true language of flowers contradiction, it also meant do not be discouraged. which is a really weird collection of representations. And there is also a legend that wormwood even plays a role in the Book of Revelations. In chapter 8 verse 11 it says, "And the name of the star is called Wormwood, and the third part of the waters became wormwood, and many men died of the waters because they were made bitter." Now, according to the legend, the drink offered to Jesus during the crucifixion was wormwood and vinegar. So it's interesting to see how you would then give what is essentially a really bitter purgative to somebody who's about to be crucified. But anyway, the Christian links don't end there, because crusading knights carried wormwood in an attempt to stave off plague, and people also used it as a flea repellent in medieval England, so perhaps the knights were actually onto something. And wormwood could also be used to repel rusalki, the dangerous water spirits of Slavic folklore that we met a few episodes ago in the lake folklore episode. And apparently where they're concerned, carrying a simple sprig could ward them off. It derives its scientific name from Artemis, the Greek goddess of chastity, and the absinthium part apparently comes from a Greek word that means undrinkable. And historically people would use it to cure intestinal worms, hence wormwood. Yet another variation on the tale says that wormwood comes from Vermut, a German word meaning preserver of the mind, and according to the website usesofherbs.com, people in days gone by thought the plant could actually boost mental capabilities. Now, it is massively hallucinogenic, so it's probably not, and it's the thujone content which gives it its psychoactive properties, which is what makes consuming too much of it toxic. Now, wormwood is the third of our magical plants, and in magical uses it could be used to call spirits, to draw a lover, or to prevent strife or war. And an old love charm actually includes wormwood along with marjoram, marigolds and thyme. Magical practitioners might use it to boost divination and develop psychic powers, although I dare say its hallucinogenic properties probably helped with this. And finally, if you burned it in a graveyard, it could apparently impel the spirits to appear and speak to the conjurer. Wormwood is also supposed to protect against bewitchment, and to be fair, that would fit in with a lot of the qualities of it being a protective plant if you put it outside your home. But I'm not sure how much its psychoactive properties really contribute to its use in speaking to spirits, but it would seem that wormwood is quite a beloved example of magical plants. And I think that's where it's quite interesting to compare a plant like wormwood to one of the more obvious choices like larkspur or periwinkle, because people who do plant wormwood tend not to do it for its flowers or whatever, but it's just because as a plant it is actually quite a pretty one just to look at its types of leaves and everything. So that is the end of this week's episode. I hope you found that interesting. As we found in the previous episode, there is such a huge diversity in what these plants represent in the language of flowers, which does make you wonder how confused did people actually get when they were sending flowers to each other and someone went, "Oh, they are saying this to me," and actually the original message was supposed to be something completely different. So I think I'm going to have to do a bit more research into that, because I do find the language of flowers quite fascinating anyway. So that is that for this week's episode. If you do have any requests, please do let me know, although I am starting to put together the final episode sort of next week anyway, and then after that we are going to move on to Roman gods again, but I'm going to focus on Roman gods as they were worshipped in Britain, because I think that opens out like a slightly different aspect to what some of them were believed to represent and stuff like that. So stick around for May, and if you've got any requests for further episodes as well, please do let me know. I'm always happy to do requests in future, so much so that I've actually added a little type form below where you can put requests in, so you don't have to send emails or find us on Twitter or anything like that. You can just go straight to that link and drop in your request, and then I'll have a look at it. So I hope that that's helpful, and I hope that it means that you get more folklore that you're interested in. But that is it for this week's episode, and I will see you next week for our final episode on poisonous plants. So until then, have a fabulous week, and I'll see you soon. Cheerio. Well, thank you for listening, and thanks for visiting Fabulous Folklore. I hope you enjoyed your stay. If you did, why not consider subscribing in your podcast app of choice? If you enjoy the show, why not leave me a review and help other listeners to find it as well? And if you'd like bonus exclusive episodes of the podcast, then why not support me on Patreon? It does help me to keep the show going, and it means that you get a little bit extra every month as well. And you can find all of the necessary links in the show notes below. So without any further ado, I will bid you adieu, and I hope that you have safe travels wherever you're going on to next.